Good afternoon. Today, Sons of Norway invites screenwriter and author Linda May Kallestein to a conversation about Atlantic Crossing, a TV series which she co-wrote. The show was inspired by the story of Crown Princess Märtha, who found refuge in the White House and fought on behalf of Norway during the tragic events of World War II. Thank you for joining me to talk about your work, Linda May.
Thank you for having me.
Growing up, you lived both in the US and in Norway. Can you tell us a bit about your personal Atlantic crossing?
Sure. I'm born in Brooklyn by Norwegian parents who immigrated to the US in the 50s. And when I was about 11, they decided to go back to Norway for a year initially, and then it turned out to be the longest year in the history of mankind. I've been living here since 1977, but I still have family stateside, and my parents also, as they grew older or towards their retirement age, they had a house in Arizona. So I've been visiting them quite a bit, and also spent almost 1 year when I was a bit younger. So I've still been in touch with America my entire life, but I've always been sort of a Norwegian American, American Norwegian, and I'm sort of split in between the two countries. So I feel like I have one foot on both sides of the Atlantic. So I don't know that I've ever crossed. I've just been standing with one leg on each side of the Atlantic the whole time, and probably all the rest of my life.
And I understand that your parents are Sons of Norway members in Stavanger. Now, were they involved with the Brooklyn Norwegian community in Bay Ridge, also known as Little Norway?
Well, I'm not quite sure if they were members, but it would surprise me if they weren't, because I can always remember Sons of Norway. That's a part of my upbringing. And I know when they were in Arizona, they were in the lodge around Phoenix, where they were living. And now, as you say, in Stavanger. So we lived in Lapskaus Boulevard, around that area, and I grew up with Norwegians around me the entire time. And it was quite funny, actually, because most of them spoke with a sort of accent, a Norwegian accent, but I didn't realize it was a Norwegian accent until I moved to Norway and got to learn the language properly, because then I was like, oh yeah, he was from Bergen. Oh yeah, she was from Kristiansand. So we were part of the Norwegian community, and I don't really remember knowing anybody who wasn't Norwegian or married to Norwegian, at least until I was about 8. And then we moved to Pennsylvania, so we were a little bit out of the city. And that's for the first time I really understood that there were people without a Norwegian background, that there were people that were, had a German background or other types of backgrounds. So it was quite funny looking back to see how Norwegian my life has always been, and how my parents have always kept their Norwegian heritage as a part of their everyday life.
Wonderful. Now, you co-wrote the series Atlantic Crossing with director and creator Alexander Eik. What inspired you to delve into the life of Crown Princess Märtha?
Well, it's been quite a long journey. Alexander read a small little notice in one of the Norwegian newspapers that referred to the rumors of a romantic relationship between Crown Princess Märtha and President Roosevelt. And it was almost too good to be true in a way. I mean, such a spicy speculation of a rumor that it's made for commercial television or movie. So we started out thinking about that this could be an interesting movie, but then we were struck by the seriousness of that. This is the mother of our current king. We have to treat this with respect. So I started off my research by going to Hyde Park, upstate New York, to the Presidential Library Museum, to go into their archives to see what I could find. And what I found there was bits and pieces of a story that put this whole notion of a romantic relationship in the shadows, something that was by far more interesting, and a story I had never heard anything about, which has to do with the Crown Princess's role as a lobbyist for Norway during the World War II, because she did spend a lot of time with President Roosevelt. She's actually the person outside of his advisor, of his advisors that he spent most time with. This is documented during the war with her, and especially the first year. And she had this unique possibility to the world's most powerful man in a time where America wasn't in the war and where the Allies in Norway absolutely needed military aid from the US. And yeah, so we found that there was something there, and we kept digging and digging and digging, and we found this story of our amazing crown princess, who almost nobody knows about. She died very early. She died in the 50s, so very few people, at least in the younger generation, even have heard of her as a person. So we became very, very inspired by this story that we fell in love with, and we're happy to make our focus point, and not just this romantic part of the story, which is also part of the story also, but it's not the main focal point.
And I've read that the research for this screenplay took up to 8 years. What methods did you use? You mentioned going to upstate New York. Did you also read Norwegian publications, and was there history to be found on the Norwegian side?
Well, there are a number of books written about World War II in Norway, and it's mainly focused on what politicians did. If you then go outside, what happens in Norway itself, and then you also have the role of the king and the crown prince. They've been focused on, and every now and again we would find a line or a paragraph about the crown princess, but she was not anything anybody bothered to focus on. In her lifetime, people still remembered, what she had done during the war, but since she died so young, that was sort of forgotten. So even though we found tidbits here and there, we sort of pieced them together to see, okay, what is the story about? And before I started working as a writer, I worked many years in a museum setting. So I was used to working with archives and historical materials, and that came in very handy now when we were doing this. So we scoured the archives, the National Archives here in Norway. We spoke to whoever we could get our hands on that were either veterans that were in their 90s, and there was a couple we, in the nick of time, spoke to before they actually passed away. So somehow had some sort of contact with the crown princess, whether they were in Little Norway during the war or had worked for the royal family at some point early on. And they were just whatever we could get our hands on. So we were working basically like detectives in a way, as historians / detectives, I would say. So yeah, we used about 8 years in total, but we were working on it on and off parallel with other projects. So we tried to figure out how much time did we actually do on the research. And I think we weren't far off that. Between the two of us, like 3 years full time. We would have 3 to 4 years full time. Our research would have taken. And I've also subsequently continued the research because I'm writing a documentary book about this. So there's still more material to be found. So that's it's an interesting topic.
No doubt. Have you heard anything about the reception from today's royal family?
We reached out to them as one of the first things we did, especially after we decided we're not going to do this, the juicy romantic rumor style thing. But they have a policy that they don't get involved with projects. They don't comment on projects. They will help out if it's, say, like a documentary book or nonfiction book, to a certain extent, that they'll allow certain writers into their material, which they've now been so gracious to do since I'm working on this nonfiction book. But otherwise, they just stay away. And I can understand that. It's, them coming out openly and saying something would put a stamp of approval, and they don't have any, they couldn't do anything with the creative choices we made. So the only response that we heard was right up before it started airing. The Crown Prince of Norway was interviewed about something and somebody asked him about Atlantic Crossing, and he said, yeah, we're really looking forward to it and we will absolutely sit down and watch it. But we never got any feedback on what he thought or anything like that. But I was like, way, the Crown Prince and Crown Princess will definitely be watching, if nothing else. So.
Oh, wonderful. Our members will also be keen to hear about this new perspective inspired by the real events in World War II. How much of the story would you say is true, and how much is creative enhancement?
Everything that goes on behind closed doors is very, very difficult, and everything when it comes to historical research to sort of have any definite understanding of what went on and what was said, who said what. So whatever's behind closed doors, private conversations, that's all creative license. But what we tried to do there was we tried to sort of think, so what would be credible? What could have happened? What could they have spoken about? What choices they made, how things were leading up to it. So again, all that is made up and creative license. But when it comes to the overall story about the Crown Princess, how she fled Norway, the time she spent in Sweden before she then went to the US. She was Swedish born. So the first stop was in Sweden for some months before she came to the US. And everything that goes on in Sweden, even though we're just we rushed through it in one episode, all that is quite factual. And when she then comes to the US, the main story of her political influence and how she went about it is true. There are some historians in Norway who still don't agree and who have had their say in the matter while it was airing here. But we are quite convinced that we have the foundation to say that she actually was she was an influence where she was. She was a powerful lobbyist for the Norwegian cause. But we stretch things. I mean, we're telling 5 years in less than 8 hours. There are many choices to be made. Sometimes you put 2 or 3 people who were alive and put them into one character. You jump in time. Sometimes you have to change the way the elements are presented. Do big time jumps sometime. And that, of course, is creative choices that we had to make, and that we felt like we could sort of say that was, proper way of going around the material. But behind most of the scenes, there is some truth to it. And like I said, sometimes when you then put several people together as one character, you also take several situations and put them together and merge them into one scene. So the scene itself might not have happened, but everything that sort of inspires that scene had some root in the truth. So it's difficult to sort of to say exactly where you put the balance, but after people have watched it, if anybody wants to know, I can point out and say that actually happened. There are some things that we just sort of copy pasted from what we found footage of, that, okay, there's no reason to make anything up here. It's powerful as it is. We have the film footage, let's just recreate it. So we did that when we could, and then we filled in all the blanks because we felt we needed to and wanted to. So yeah, it's not a documentary, but there's a lot of truth in fiction.
Great. And were you involved in the filming process of Atlantic Crossing? And if so, do you have any behind the scenes anecdotes about this cross-cultural drama?
Well, most of the filming happened in the Czech Republic. So that's where about 6 months of the 7 months, I would say, was actually filmed. There were some weeks filmed in Norway, especially with the exteriors. As a writer, you're very rarely included in the shooting process, but I was fortunate enough to be there the first week of shooting in Prague. And that was amazing because you come into this huge production buildings, and the part of the White House, the Oval Office and the surrounding rooms were created on a 1-to-1 scale. So you would come from this really, hectic back lot, almost like a storage facility, a lot of people walking around, a lot of equipment, and then walk into the Oval Office. And you didn't see one light. It was just like they had lit it up from the outside. So it seemed like there was, light, natural light coming in, and the only light sources were the lamps that were there. And of course, the first thing everybody did was sit in the chair of the president behind the desk there. So that was the first thing that everybody did. And it was just like this amazing feeling of, it was awe-inspiring. So for me, it was basically this just experience of being on the set and then wandering from room to room and forgetting actually being on a set, but feeling that I could actually just move in and live there. So as far as antidotes, when it comes to production, the only thing I can tell of my experience was that I became extremely starstruck when I met Kyle MacLachlan, who plays President Roosevelt, who I'm pretty sure many people know from Twin Peaks and Sex and the City. And I was so starstruck to the point that when I was introduced to him just a few minutes before the shooting, the first scene was being shot. I couldn't say anything. And he was standing there politely, as people often do, and say, I love the script. And, he was praising everything. And I'm just like, yeah. And then afterwards, like, oh no, my goodness, how stupid. You were like this arrogant person, just receiving praise, not saying how thrilled I was that he was, going to portray the president. So, but then I told him afterwards that I'm sorry, I was so starstruck, and he just laughed and said, you know what, that's quite fine. You're used to that. But so that was my first day of filming, that I couldn't actually say a word to the people I should have spoken to. But other than that, I just sort of stopped by here and again to sort of see. I was there that first week, and when they were filming in Norway, I came aboard on one ship where they were filming and stuff like that. So otherwise, my role behind the scenes is we have to cut out 10 pages or 20 pages or so many locations. And then you got to go back to the script, and you have to do this terrible task of just shortening down everything like that. So in many ways, my job is done the moment they press or say action the first time, though.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank you for sharing your time with our members, and I wish you and the show a really great US premiere.
Thank you. Very much looking forward to it airing on PBS, and hope that the reception is as wonderful as it's been every other place that has been aired so far. So anybody want to shout out anything about what they liked and didn't like, they'd be thrilled to hear about it.
Thank you so much, Linda May.
Thank you.